2.6 to 3.1. There's three things that kind of get the Americans to start thinking about independence and start protesting the different acts. So this is kind of the pre-road to revolution, if you will. The first of the three things is the Franklin Plan of Union, also known as the Albany Plan. And if you remember, Albany is in New York, and that's where our first capital was before Washington, D.C. was built. But Ben Franklin, we oftentimes wonder, why is he on the $100 bill when he was not a president? Ben Franklin was never a president. And the reason is because not that he's a founding father per se, but he's a founding grandfather. What do I mean by that? Yes, he was a part of the Constitutional Convention, the Declaration of Independence. He was a diplomat during the American Revolution, but he was so much more even before that. And so he was the first one to think of the United States or the United Colonies as a union, if you will. Everybody else before Ben Franklin was thinking of the colonies as individual territories, individual identities. I'm from Virginia, you're from New York, you're from Massachusetts, things like that. But he was the first one to think of themselves as American. And so what he proposed was three things in his plan of union. He proposed a grand council of representatives from each colony, basically kind of like a Congress, that they could vote congressionally, federally on matters as a union instead of just having state councils and state legislatures and Congress. He also wanted a uniform Indian policy. This was to have a united foreign policy with Native Americans in the Western territories. He also wanted a continental tax. The colonists were used to paying taxes at state level, but he wanted a federal tax. So he's the first one that proposes this federal tax to assist with new settlements in the frontier, especially in Tennessee and Kentucky and the Ohio Valley and everything. However, this all failed. And the reason this failed is that the American patriots, they didn't want to surrender their rights or their autonomy as individual states. They were afraid of a federal government. We'll see this continually throughout American history. They didn't want to lose their autonomy, if they will. They were afraid of this federal government that would assume everything of the states, but they liked being small states. Also, Great Britain feared losing control of the colonies, and so Great Britain really soured the idea as well. This is the famous picture that Ben Franklin created, the join or die motto. He was the first one to look at America as the snake there. And so as you see, the snake is, if it's divided, it will die. So if South Carolina and North Carolina and Virginia and Maryland, if they're all, separate from Rhode Island, New Jersey, New York, New England, which represents, of course, the Massachusetts and Connecticut and such, then that would be an issue. And so he really wanted to unify the colonies there and such. And actually, I think that's Pennsylvania, not Rhode Island, because Rhode Island was part of the New England colonies. But you don't need to write that down. But then we have the Great Awakening. The Great Awakening broke that dependence on centrally organized religion. The Great Awakening was a religious church movement, a Christian movement, definitely, but it was anti-quote-unquote religion in that it really focused on that it's personal, not about simply listening to an archbishop or a pope, but more about your individual relationship before God. It's also unified the colonies. This is the first time they called themselves American. This was the first American experience. It also stresses personal accountability before God, kind of this individualism. So just like it broke that dependence on centrally organized religion, no longer will you have these state religions that are forcing people to go to church, but now you'll have a lot of different denominations. This is when the Baptists start identifying themselves as such, and you start having Methodists and others that start to develop during this time period, the first Great Awakening. You would have the likes like Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield, Tennant, that would really produce this movement. And so the Great Awakening is not just a religious movement, but it also has a lot to do with getting the people to think about independence and individualism. So this really lays the groundwork to the American Revolution. And then, of course, the French-Indian War. This is the French-Indian War because it's the French and the Indians versus the British. So keep that in mind. It's not French versus the Indians per se. The French had a strong alliance with the Indians. And so throughout the river trade networks, they would trade together. So the French allied with the Huron and the Ottawa versus the British, but the British allied with the Iroquois Confederation. The Iroquois Confederation was at odds with the Huron and the Ottawa, and so that's why they allied with the British, the Iroquois Confederation, which consisted of the Mohawks, the Mohicans, and actually Fenimore Cooper's book, Last of the Mohicans, is all about this right here. This was fought over the Ohio Valley, and so they're debating on, does the Ohio Valley belong to the French or does it belong to the British? And so this is fought over that. George Washington, Colonel George Washington, under the British Army, was actually the first one to ask the French to surrender. When they said no, he built Fort Necessity, and the French-Indian War would begin because of Colonel George Washington. The outcome is really what's important. The outcome caused a high British debt because the British were obsessed with victory. This was the last of the 4 wars known as the 100 Years' Wars. This was the second 100 Years' Wars. There was a first 100 Years' Wars between France and Britain. When Joan of Arc was famous, when the British longbow, when the French had the crossbow. That was the first 100 Years' War, but this is the second 100 Years' Wars. Yes, France and Britain have been fighting for a long time, and this is the last of that second 100 Years' Wars, which consisted of the Three Musketeers, Men in the Iron Mask, those different things there. And so the British were really obsessed with debt, and so they passed a lot of taxes and acts because of this French-Indian War. If the French-Indian War hadn't have happened, the taxes and acts wouldn't have happened, and the American Revolution would not have happened. The French were kicked out of North America, and why this is important is because the British will assume control, as you can see on the right-hand side, control of all the Ohio Valley. So Britain will really focus a lot more of their attention on the New World instead of just allowing this salutary neglect for the colonists to run independently of the motherland. Also, what will happen is that the Native Americans will expect for the British to act like the French did and give a lot of gifts, but that won't happen. And then also the colonial militias are now trained as a result. The British had trained the colonists to be these militias. Militia is a civilian army to protect the British areas and everything. And so these militias, now that they're trained by the British against the French, these same militias can use that training later, 20 years later, during the American Revolution. And so the training of these militias was huge to prepare the colonists to be able to fight against the British. This is much like how America trained Al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden during the 1970s and 1980s invasion of Afghanistan by the Russians. When the Russians invaded Afghanistan, our enemy was the Russians, the Soviets, the communists, and so we believed that our enemy's enemy was our friend, and so we helped the Osama bin Laden and Taliban, the terrorists, to protect themselves against the Russians. Well, 20 years later, the terrorists would then have us as their enemy, and they would use the same equipment against U.S. soldiers. So it's kind of the same thing with these colonial militias, now trained. We're going to start off with Pontiac's Rebellion. Chief Pontiac. Pontiac's Rebellion, you don't need to write wanted gifts like the French, but you should write down Chief Pontiac was angered over the westward movement of English settlers. Write that down. So Britain started to respond with troops instead of militia. if Britain had never sent troops to the Americas, the American Revolution may not have happened. But Britain wanted to establish a presence, as was noted in the Socratic. And so because of this Indian War right here, remember the French-Indian War, the French were kicked out of North America, so Pontiac, Chief Pontiac, which is what the car, the Pontiac, is named after, and all of his confederation of Native American tribes, they did not like that the English were different than the French. They liked the French gifts and everything. Now the English are like, hey, the new boss is in town. They're not giving those gifts, so they're being angered over that. But it's more so this westward movement. Okay, did the colonists, the American colonists, did they think that this Ohio Valley was going to be open for settlement after the French and Indian War? They did. They thought that all this Ohio area, that, Pennsylvania, New York, and Virginia were not going to be the only colonies, but that they could move westward. And that's why the colonists fought during the American Revolution. They were thinking, hey, out of fighting, this French and Indian War, we are going to get more land. Well, in reality, the Proclamation of 1763 was set up, and that was the British policy to prevent future Indian hostilities by limiting westward expansion, okay? You don't need to write down word for word, but you need to understand, and this goes back to junior high class and whatnot, but the Proclamation line of 1763, we really don't give that one enough credit, meaning that we don't really consider how important it was for Americans that they wanted this westward land. Okay, so this westward land, this Ohio territory, was very important to the Americans. I mean, this gets back to Manifest Destiny. Ladies and gentlemen, Manifest Destiny is not just a James K. Polk, President Polk, idea. It's not just a Mexican-American War concept. It's not just a, after the cotton gin and everything, westward expansion, Manifest Destiny. No, Manifest Destiny was at the beginning of America. There was this hope that if you have more land out west, okay, that you could be a better American. This whole idea of pursuit of happiness, American dream, was going out west. And this proclamation line, because did Britain really care about the natives? No. What did they not want to happen? Indian wars, exactly. They didn't want to spend all kinds of money on these Indian wars, so their idea was, let's have peace with the natives. We're not going to give any gifts to the natives like the French did, but we're not going to allow westward movement, and that really angered the colonists. Then we have this policy of salutary neglect. What does the word neglect mean? To leave something alone, to ignore. And if a parent neglects you, that's probably not a good thing. But if a study hall teacher neglects you, then that's kind of a good thing, right? It's salutary. I can take advantage of that, right? So this allowed for rules to be unenforced, and it also allowed self-government in each colony. This was the previous policy. As long as Britain made money off the colonists, because, America was just a huge place of resources. As long as they could get the resources from America, they really didn't enforce all the trade until Britain needed money. It's kind of like that friendship that maybe you have. A friendship that's very, casual, and sometimes they pay, sometimes you pay. But what happens when that person is hard up on money and they need you to pay them back? Then it starts to get a little bit more awkward. And that's how it is with America and Great Britain. So that salutary neglect starts to end with all of these acts, such as the Sugar Act. Now, the Sugar Act was not a new act, but it raised money for debt, and it aimed at smugglers and didn't allow these smugglers jury trials. So there was previously a Sugar Act, but nobody really paid it. It was super unenforced. There was salutary neglect. The British, they neglected to really, get the tax. It's kind of like your dress code, right? Last couple of years, because of COVID and supply chain issues, teachers really didn't enforce dress code that much. And now all of a sudden, when we have all these new students and chaos will abound if we don't enforce dress code, we start enforcing it, and then the protests start happening from the students, So the Sugar Act, it was to raise money for debt. It's really the smugglers that started to get caught in this, and it really put a lot of harsh, no jury trials for these smugglers, but that they were going to be tried by the Vice Admiralty courts. So this all of a sudden made smuggling a big issue, It was kind of like, before the war on drugs, marijuana wasn't that big of an issue. But when we started having this war on drugs, all of a sudden there was a huge penalty, even more than cocaine, okay? Marijuana started becoming this huge thing that was being cracked down on, okay? Then we have the Stamp Act. This is probably the most important of them. Why is the Stamp Act so important? Because it's the first direct tax. That's important. Make sure you write down first direct tax. The colonists responded with boycotts. This is kind of the first time the colonists really wake up. The colonists really start realizing, wow, something's going on. And so the colonists respond with these boycotts. The London merchants suffer the most from this, though. I know that there was somebody who will not be named who said, those boycotts, And in some degree, maybe, okay. However, these boycotts did affect the London merchants so much that they were like, hey, Parliament, you got to do something. So it wasn't that Parliament was listening to America. Parliament could care less about the colonists. It's that these London merchants all of a sudden were not getting bought the things that they were selling to the Americans because they were boycotting it, that these London merchants started talking to Parliament and saying, you need to do something or we're going to vote you out of office, okay? And so that's why the Parliament would remove the Stamp Act. It's not because they listened to Patrick Henry. Does anybody remember what he said?
Give me liberty or give me death.
Give me liberty or give me death. Very good, okay? A true statement said today, as opposed to the false statements said today.
They're controversial. They are not.
It's okay. It's okay. So this led to the Stamp Act Congress. You need to put an arrow from Stamp Act to Stamp Act Congress. That's what the SAC is. Okay, the Stamp Act Congress. Protest meeting. This Stamp Act Congress was a protest meeting with delegates from different colonies. They agreed that only their own representatives had power to approve taxes. This is huge, okay? We believed in these Enlightenment ideas, but this is the first time that we actually write it down. This is the first time that we actually unify with this idea that representative government approves taxes, not, a king or a despot. And this is important because this is in our Constitution, ladies and gentlemen. Who alone has the power to create laws? Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution. Anybody know? Who only has the power to make laws in America? Not the judges, not the president or the executive, but Congress alone. Article 1, Section 1. But check this out. A raising of taxes, does anybody know, is it the House or the Senate that is the only one that can raise taxes? It's not the Senate, it's the House. It's the House because the House is based on population, not based on two per state. Okay, so only Congress, and more specifically, the House of Representatives, your Congress people, are the only ones that can actually approve taxes. If I'm going too fast for you, you can get this on Google Classroom as well. I'm recording this for those who are not able to join us. The Sons and Daughters of Liberty. okay? These sons and daughters of liberty, they were nasty, okay? Not just nasty because they stink like rum, okay? But nasty because they were brutal. They poured boiling tea down the throat of tax collectors. You know, oh, you want your tea tax? I'll give you your tea tax, and pour boiling tea down their throats, okay? They would bully them. They would tar and feather them. This tar and feathering, ladies and gentlemen, is not a light thing. A lot of times you died from tarring and feathering because the tar all over your body is going to give you this heat stroke, okay? Let alone, how do you take tar off of skin? I mean, your epidermis is removed, okay? Yeah, it's boiling oil. So, like, your skin is toast, okay? You usually die from tarring and feathering. It's a torture way to generally kill somebody. So these sons of liberty, they were bad news. Samuel Adams was a son of liberty, okay? John Adams, on the other hand, he didn't agree with their harsh tactics. So the two cousins, they're both cousins, they were on different spectrums. The John Adams was more conservative. Samuel Adams, a lot more radical and progressive. The Declaratory Act, Parliament replaced the Stamp Act with this policy that said they had the right to tax and make laws for the colonies in cases whatsoever. We reviewed this. You don't need to write it word for word. But to understand the Declaratory Act took the place of the Stamp Act, not because Britain's trying to listen to America, but because these London merchants are, really losing out because of the boycotts. So this is an amazing act because Britain, they're removing this to get the boycotts to stop, but in reality, the Americans are losing even more of their rights by Parliament saying, hey, we can do whatever we want to you, okay? And you have to obey. If you don't, we'll just keep sending more troops over to your country and treat you like a third world territory, if you will, instead of actual British subjects, okay? Again, you don't need to write down word for word. The next one that we have is the Townshend Acts. Now, the Townshend Acts, colonists accepted this indirect tax at first, but then protested this taxation without representation with boycotts, okay? So they accepted it at first, but then they started to boycott it. You do not need to write this next section that is italicized, but this led to the Massachusetts Circular Letter. You don't need to write that down. This led to John Dickinson's letter from a farmer in Pennsylvania, and he used the pseudonym A Farmer. So the British did not know there was John Dickinson writing these pamphlets because he would have been thrown in jail. He would have been executed. So he used the pen name A Farmer. The Gaspee incident. Again, you don't need to write this down. The Gaspee incident will not be on the test. But the British ship, because of this Townshend Acts, they were trying to attack smugglers. John Hancock, if you remember, he's the one who wrote the biggest signature on the Declaration of Independence because he wanted King George, who had bad eyesight at 20 years old. I know that we think that King George III was so old because he had bad eyesight. He was actually pretty young with bad eyesight. But John Hancock wanted the king to know that he was on the list. It was kind of a middle finger, if you will, to the king. John Hancock was a smuggler. Okay, and one of his boats was being chased by the Gaspee, and the Gaspee ran aground. A bunch of the Sons of Liberty ran up to that boat, lit it on fire. I mean, if you can imagine, a light cruiser, American ship being burned by Americans who, were protesting something, that's kind of what's happening here. And then we have the Boston Massacre, okay? Colonists were harassing British troops that were stationed in America. 5 colonists were were shot. Now, as you see this picture right here, this picture will appear on the test. Did the British organize the shooting of these Americans? No, this was an accident. So this picture right here does not represent it. But why do you think the famous Paul Revere made the picture like this of the Boston Massacre?
To dramatize it and to get the citizens unified.
Exactly. Dramatize how evil the British are. John Adams actually defended the troops in court and gave them a fair trial. Why do you think that is? You only have liberty if you have justice, right? So even though Samuel Adams wanted these guys to fry, Samuel Adams was at the Boston Massacre. He wanted these British to be all hanged, okay? But John Adams said, no, we cannot be known as a country of injustice. That's what Britain would do to us. We're going to be better. And John Adams would say at the end of his life that this was the most important moment in his life, was defending these 5 soldiers. Not helping Thomas Jefferson with the Declaration of Independence, not being the second president, not being the vice president to George Washington. But this moment was important to him. Then we have letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania. John Dickinson, one of my favorite of the founding fathers during the American Revolution, he argued that Parliament had the right to impose tariffs on the colonies to regulate commerce, but not to raise revenue. And this was something that we discussed in our Socratic seminar, that the early founding fathers saw the necessity for taxes, but more of for regulating commerce versus just simply raising revenue. And so the American patriots felt like they were being abused and that their rights were being abused. And this is one of the moments where I personally start to agree with the founding fathers. Earlier on, I tended to disagree, especially with the Sons of Liberty and their aggressiveness and everything. I'm somebody who wishes if the founding fathers would have waited longer and not been as violent, and it's called a reconcilist. I feel like America and Britain could have reconciled. However, by this point, John Dickinson makes a great argument that Parliament was trying to use the American patriots, the American colonists, to raise revenue instead of just simply regulating commerce through tariffs and such. Then we have Massachusetts Circular Letter. This is James Otis and Samuel Adams. They asked colonists to petition Parliament. So this Massachusetts Circular Letter, that was to get everybody on the same page to petition Parliament so that Parliament would listen. Because remember, it's not the King George III that the Patriots have an issue with, but it's with Parliament, because Parliament is the one passing these acts. The Committees of Correspondence, this was also organized by Samuel Adams. This was an organization that regularly exchanged letters about suspicious and threatening British activity. So this was kind of the early Twitter or maybe Call of Duty chat lines that have been used in the past about these secret discussions and letters and such. And so back then they didn't use social media and such, online gaming, but they used actual letters. And so they kept in touch with what the British were doing. And this was how they were able to alert throughout the colonies anytime that the British were trying to confiscate weapons or things like that, kind of like through Paul Revere's ride. Paul Revere was alerted that he needed to stand watch, 1 if by land, 2 if by sea, because of the Committees of Correspondence. Then we get the Tea Act. The Tea Act was Parliament's effort to improve the profits of the British East India Company. What a lot of people misunderstand is that the Tea Act was not a new or heightened tax that everybody didn't want to pay for, but actually this one was a little bit different than the other ones. This was simply a monopoly that the British East Indian Company was trying to have on tea, and so they actually made the tea cheaper than the colonial tea, so that the colonists would buy it instead of constantly boycotting it and growing their own. They even had a little tiny tax on it, but it was so small that they thought the colonists would still pay for it. However, the colonists responded with growing their own tea and dumping the tea into the harbor, and this became the famous Boston Tea Party, where the colonists dressed up like Native Americans, the Sons of Liberty did, and they threw overboard over 300 chests of tea into the harbor because the ship had not unloaded yet because nobody was willing to pay for or unload the tea there. And then we have the Coercive Acts. This is in response to the Boston Tea Party, so Parliament responds. They close the Boston port until all the dumped tea is paid for. They also establish royal governor has authority over Massachusetts, so they end all of the town hall meetings in Massachusetts and the legislature, so they really put the place under martial law, so to speak, with the royal governors. The royal officials also, anytime that they are accused of a crime, they would be tried in England instead of in the colonies. Common law states that you have to face your accusers and give the accusers the right to testify. But if these royal officials that are accused of crimes, and that happened a lot, are being tried in England, then the colonists cannot represent. This also had a renewed quartering act. So now troops are being housed in homes instead of just abandoned warehouses and barns. And so this is a heightening quartering act. This is all to punish the Boston Tea Party and the events, and this really pushes them over the edge. But then the Quebec Act is signed, and this took away representative government in Canada. So Canada would not have representative government, but would be under official royal rule, and also made Roman Catholicism the official religion. The Parliament thought that they could appease the French that were in Quebec and such, and so they wanted it to be a Roman Catholic jurisdiction. However, this really made the Patriots and the colonists frustrated because they started to dislike state religions and government control of religion and enforcing a religion, and so they wanted more of that separation of church and state. And so the government in England was really forcing that Catholicism on Quebec, and so there was this fear that it was going to go to the colonies as well, and that the British were going to institute the same in the colonies. And that's the end of the notes right there that you need to know for the test.